Most stories about beginnings sound familiar, no matter which culture tells them. A god speaks, and light appears. A deity stretches out a hand, and mountains rise. Sometimes the act is violent. Chaos is carved in two, or a serpent is slain to make room for order. Other times, the act is tender. Clay molded into shape, breath pressed into lifeless matter. The pattern is so deeply etched into human imagination that it feels almost inevitable. If there is a world, surely it began with someone's will, someone's choice, a voice of command echoing in the void. But not this one. The Gnostics whispered a different tale. Their creation story begins not with sound, but with silence. Not with form, but with formlessness. Not with the will of a god, but with something so complete that it had no need to create at all. Imagine, if you can, a reality before time, before stars, before the very idea of a beginning. A realm not of absence, but of fullness. They called it the Pleroma, a Greek word meaning the fullness. The Pleroma was not heaven. It was not paradise. It was not even a place in the sense that a human mind can grasp. To describe it is to fail. To name it is to mislead, and yet one can try. Think of it as a field of total presence, an ocean without shores, an endless depth where nothing is missing, nothing is broken, and nothing is separate from anything else. If heaven is the dream of humanity's reunion with the divine, then the Pleroma was that dream already fulfilled, without beginning, without end. From this stillness, something stirred, not an act of will, not the decision of a deity. It was more like an overflowing, just as a spring overflows with water, not because it chooses to, but because fullness cannot be contained. So too did the source at the heart of the Pleroma overflow. The Gnostics called that source the monad. It was pure being, beyond thought, beyond name, beyond anything the human mind could hold. And from the monad's overflowing came motion. Not the sudden flare of lightning, but the slow, unfolding ripple of thought into thought, being into being. These were the Aeons. The Aeons were not gods in the way most people imagine gods. They did not thunder from mountaintops. They did not demand sacrifices. They were not even beings with personalities. To call them gods would be to shrink them, to fit them into a box far too small. They were principles, forces, radiant dimensions of the monad's infinite mind. Where one tradition might say wisdom, the Gnostics said Sophia, not as an abstraction, but as an actual presence, an aeon, living and real. Where others said truth, they spoke of aletheia, another aeon. Reason became logos. Grace became charis. Each of these qualities was not just an idea, but a ripple of reality itself, given form within the fullness of the Pleroma. The observer sees them like reflections in water, shimmering, intangible, yet undeniable. Aeons moving in pairs, called syzygies, masculine and feminine, active and receptive, each completing the other. They did not rule, they did not command. Their action was not action as humans know it, but presence, a resonance eternal and unbroken. This is where the story of the Aeons begins. Not with a single creator, but with a vast harmony of emanations. 30 in all, according to the Valentinian Gnostics. These 30 Aeons together form the spiritual architecture of existence, arranged like light through a stained glass window, impossible to grasp in full, but breathtaking in its fragments. And yet, even here, something will go wrong. But not yet. First, there is only stillness and beauty, the dance of the Aeons in balance. Imagine it, depth and silence as the first pair, mind and truth as their children. word and life as the next, humanity and unity following after. This is the Ogdoad, the first 8. From them come more, then more again, spiraling outward in luminous tears. Aeons upon aeons, ripples within ripples, a divine ecosystem where every quality of the source finds its reflection. The story could have ended there. A realm of perfection, untouched, unbroken. But perfection, at least in myth, rarely remains untouched. Something always stirs at the edges. A question, a yearning, a pull. And it is at the very edge of the Pleroma, among the youngest of the Aeons, that this yearning will ignite. Her name was Sophia. But that is not for now. For now, the observer lingers at the threshold of this strange cosmology. The human mind, used to thrones and tempests, finds it hard to rest in silence. The impulse is to demand, who is in charge? Who commands this? But the answer here is unsettling. No one commands. No one rules. The monad does not create because it must. It simply overflows, and what overflows becomes the Aeons. This is not creation as conquest. It is creation as radiance. And from that radiance will emerge both beauty and fracture, harmony and tragedy, the fullness of the divine and the flawed world we now inhabit. The story of the Aeons is not a tale of beginnings and endings, but of echoes. Echoes from a place beyond stars, trying to reach the human soul even now. At the heart of the Gnostic vision lies a paradox. The world we know is vast, ancient, filled with galaxies, suns, and countless forms of life. And yet, it is not the original. Beneath the surface of all matter, beyond the shimmer of the visible universe, the Gnostics pointed to something far older, far stranger, the monad. The monad was not a god in the sense people worshipped in temples. It was not Zeus hurling thunderbolts, nor Yahweh speaking the world into being, nor Ra guiding the sun across the heavens. The monad had no form, no will, no desire. It was pure being, absolute, unconditioned, unknowable. To speak of it was already to diminish it. To think of it was to place limits where none could be drawn. In silence, it simply was. The observer imagines the monad, not as a king seated upon a throne, but as an endless depth. The Gnostics sometimes called it bythos, the abyss, the unfathomable depth. Other times they called it silence. See, the stillness before the first thought stirs. If you hold your breath at midnight, with no sound but the pulse of your blood, you may touch the shadow of what they meant. The monad was that stillness, but magnified beyond measure. And yet, from this silence, something began to flow. Not because the monad chose to create. Choice implies lack, and the monad lacked nothing. Not because it desired, desire implies emptiness, and the monad was already full. No, the monad simply overflowed. Picture water brimming over the lip of a vessel, not because someone tipped it, but because it could not contain its fullness. This was how the Gnostics imagined creation, not as a deliberate act, but as a radiance, a spilling forth of what was too abundant to remain hidden. From the monad's fullness came emanations, echoes, reflections, expansions of the divine mind. These emanations were the Aeons. Each Aeon was not an individual personality, but a principle of existence, alive yet beyond form. If the monad was unknowable, the Aeons were its self-expressions, the ways it revealed something of itself without ceasing to be infinite. The Gnostics gave them names that sound like virtues, but which they meant quite literally. Aletheia, truth. Logos, reason. Charis, grace. Sophia, wisdom. These were not poetic metaphors, but living dimensions of being, radiant streams flowing out of the monad's inexhaustible source. To understand this, The observer reaches for metaphor. Imagine language. A single thought rises in the mind, and then it ripples outward into words. Each word is not the thought itself, but an expression of it. Each carries a fragment of meaning, a shard of the whole. In the same way, each aeon was an expression of the monad's infinite depth. Not the source itself, but an emanation of it. The aeons did not appear chaotically. They came in syzygies, pairs of harmonics, masculine and feminine, active and receptive. Not male and female in the earthly sense, but as complementary polarities, like day and night or seed and soil. One expressed, the other received. One initiated, the other completed. Together they formed wholeness. The first to emerge was Nous, the divine mind, and his counterpart, Aletheia, truth. From mind's contemplation arose truth itself, radiant and unshakable. Then came Logos, reason, paired with Zoe, life. Where Logos provided order, structure, and meaning, Zoe poured vitality into all. From them, further aeons rippled outward, unfolding the infinite into distinct yet harmonious expressions. The observer pauses here to note how different this is from other cosmologies. In most traditions, creation is an act of power, spoken into being by command, hammered into shape by a craftsman, or fought into order by victory over chaos. But in Gnostic thought, creation at its highest level was not war, nor labor, nor will. It was overflow. It was the spreading out of fullness, the unfolding of wholeness into many dimensions of itself. And yet, the Aeons were not the world. They were not stars, or planets, or mountains, or seas. They were the structures of divine thought, the building blocks of meaning itself. To mistake them for anthropomorphic gods would be like mistaking mathematics for the numbers written on a chalkboard. They were not the symbols, but the reality to which the symbols point. This is why Gnostics resisted calling them gods. To do so would be to lower them, to confine them to temples and rituals, to imagine them jealous or wrathful. The Aeons did not punish. They did not bless. They simply were eternal presences, facets of a perfection that overflowed but never diminished. And so, within the Pleroma, Aeons multiplied, pair by pair, until they formed a great spiritual architecture. 30 Aeons in all, according to one of the most detailed Gnostic systems, the Valentinian. These were not random or chaotic, but ordered, like concentric rings spiraling out from the central source. At the innermost stood depth and silence. Beyond them, mind and truth. Beyond them again, reason and life. Further and further they rippled outward, each reflecting another aspect of the monad. It is here, in this unfolding, that Sophia would one day appear. But for now, the Aeons dwell in balance, radiant and unbroken, a chorus of qualities that human language would later reduce to virtues. Scholars today still debate where the Gnostics drew these ideas from. Were they influenced by Plato's vision of perfect forms, abstract and eternal? Did echoes of Persian dualism creep into their cosmology? The struggle of light and darkness hidden beneath their language of fullness and absence? Or was it drawn from within Judaism itself, a mystical reinterpretation of the Word that was with God in the beginning? The truth remains uncertain. What is clear is that the Gnostics turned away from the idea of creation by decree and embraced instead the image of emanation, of fullness overflowing into fullness. This, then, is the strange paradox at the root of their myth. A universe that begins not because it must, but because it can't help but do so. A source that creates not by command, but by radiance. And aeons, not gods of thunder and flame, but presences, living concepts, eternal harmonics that whisper still in the language of wisdom, truth, reason, and grace. The observer lingers again in the silence, feeling how foreign this story is, and yet how haunting. For in the heart of every human being beats the sense that words like truth, wisdom, love, and life are not merely descriptions, but realities, things that are. The Gnostics dared to say, yes, they are real. They are the Aeons, the forgotten gods. If the monad was the spring, then the Aeons were its streams, each flowing outward yet never separate from the source. But where did they dwell? In the vision of the Gnostics, their home was neither earth nor heaven, neither sky nor afterlife. It was something subtler, stranger, a realm called the Pleroma, the fullness. The Pleroma was not to be confused with paradise. Paradise is imagined as a garden, lush and fragrant, where the weary may rest. The Pleroma was not imagined at all, for it could not be pictured. It was not a place. It was a state, a field of consciousness where every quality of the divine existed in radiant harmony. If heaven could be lost, won, or bargained for, the Pleroma was beyond such conditions. It was never absent, never lacking, never broken. The observer sees it as ripples within ripples, an ocean where each wave is not water, but meaning. Wisdom flows into truth, truth into life, life into unity. Nothing competes, nothing contradicts. Each aeon is a tone, and together they form a chord too vast for human ears, a music not heard but known. In the Pleroma, the aeons moved in syzygies, paired harmonics, not male and female in flesh, but polarities, active and receptive, seed and soil, flame and shadow. The Gnostics taught that reality itself unfolds in twos. Thought requires truth. Word requires life. Grace requires love. Without its counterpart, each is incomplete, but together, they mirror the wholeness of the monad. This pairing was not arbitrary. It was the divine order itself, a symmetry that gave structure to the infinite. The Aeons, dwelling in syzygies, reflected the balance of fullness. It was, in a sense, a theology of complementarity. Each Aeon expressed something, but never alone. The divine mind unfolded itself in pairs, as though creation's language was always spoken in harmony. The Pleroma itself was described as luminous, though not with light that the eye can see. It was a brightness of awareness, a radiance of meaning. Imagine clarity so complete that nothing can be hidden, and yet nothing is exposed. Imagine being so complete that no desire stirs, and yet no stagnation exists. That was the quality of the Pleroma. The Gnostics insisted that the Pleroma was not a distant heaven, but a deeper reality, veiled from human perception by the illusion of matter. They spoke of it as near, yet unreachable. In dreams, in sudden moments of insight, one might glimpse it as through stained glass, fractured colors, patterns of radiance that hint at something behind. But the fullness itself remained beyond. And yet, paradoxically, everything human beings call good, truth, wisdom, love, peace, was a reflection of the Aeons who dwelt there. When a person speaks truth, it is not merely human invention, it is the resonance of aletheia. When a person shows love, it is not merely emotion, but the echo of agape. When a soul feels alive in the deepest sense, it is a spark of Zoe, the Aeon of life, shining through. The Pleroma, then, was not absent from the world. Its qualities still reverberated here, like distant thunder heard from beyond a mountain. The prison of matter could not erase the resonance entirely. The Aeons remained the archetypes of all that was divine in humanity, even if most forgot their source. Scholars today still puzzle over the origins of this vision. Some argue that the Pleroma echoes Plato's world of forms, the realm of perfect realities from which earthly shadows fall. Others suggest it was shaped by Jewish mysticism, where God's attributes, wisdom, glory, power, were envisioned as emanations of the divine. Still others believe the Pleroma was a poetic answer to a human problem. How can perfection coexist with imperfection? How can a pure source give rise to a flawed world? The Gnostics solved it by separating the two. The Pleroma as the realm of perfection, and the material cosmos as its distorted reflection. The observer reflects that this idea was not mere speculation, but existential. To the Gnostics, life felt broken. Death, injustice, ignorance, suffering. These were not accidents, but the marks of a flawed creation. If the divine source was truly perfect, then the world around them could not be its direct work. There must be something higher, untouched, unsullied. That something was the Pleroma. Inside it, the Aeons existed not as rulers, but as presences. They did not judge, command, or intervene. Their being was resonance. In this sense, the Pleroma was not about control, but about reflection. Every quality of the monad mirrored in a living principle. 30 Aeons, 15 syzygies, arranged like constellations in a sky that was never night. One can imagine it as a cathedral of light, each Aeon a stained glass window depicting not images, but essences. Truth, life, love, peace, wisdom, unity. As the light of the monad passed through, each pane revealed a color, a form, a resonance. Taken together, they were the fullness. But harmony, in myth, is never the end. Perfection contains within it the tension of its own fragility. The further the emanations extended from the monad, the closer they drew to the boundary, the edge where fullness thins into absence. And it was there, at the margin of the Pleroma, that something would stir. Her name was Sophia, wisdom, youngest of the Aeons, last in the unfolding order. She dwelt at the outermost circle, closest to the veil that separated the Pleroma from what lay beyond. In her, the seed of longing began to burn. But that is for later. For now, it is enough to know that the Pleroma was the heart of Gnostic vision, not a throne room ruled by one, but a chorus of 30, not a battlefield of gods, but a harmony of emanations. It was, to the Gnostics, the real reality, eternal, unbroken, radiant, and everything we know is but its distorted shadow. From the stillness of the monad flowed the emanations, and from these emanations arose the Aeons. But they did not scatter chaotically. They unfolded in order, in a pattern so intricate and luminous that later Gnostics spoke of it as a kind of sacred architecture, the living geometry of the divine mind. The observer lingers on this structure, for it is unlike anything in the stories of Olympus or Asgard. There, gods competed, quarreled, plotted. Here nothing was random. The Aeons appeared in syzygies, pairs of harmonics, each complementing the other, balancing active with receptive, thought with truth, word with life. Theirs was not a hierarchy of power, but of resonance, each pair forming a unity that reflected the fullness of the monad. The Valentinians, one of the great schools of Gnostic thought, preserved the most elaborate account of this unfolding. They described not a multitude without order, but 30 Aeons, arranged in 15 pairs. This arrangement was not arbitrary. It was a map of divine consciousness, each Aeon an expression of the source, each syzygy a window into the unbroken radiance of the Pleroma. The first tier was called the Ogdoad, 8 Aeons, 4 syzygies, closest to the monad itself. They were the roots, the foundation. From them would spring the rest. Beyond the Ogdoad was the Decad. 10 Aeons and 5 syzygies, expanding the harmony. And beyond them, completing the circle, the Dodecad. 12 Aeons and 6 syzygies, dwelling at the edge of the Pleroma, nearest the veil of separation. Together, they formed a whole. 30 Aeons, 15 harmonics, 1 divine fullness. The Ogdoad began with Bethos and Sije, depth and silence. They were the first reflections of the monad, the abyss of infinite being and the silence in which all possibility rests. Bethos was the fathomless depth that could never be measured. Sije the quiet that allows all things to emerge. Together they symbolized mystery itself, the condition before thought, before voice, before creation. From them came Nous and Aletheia, mind and truth. Nous was the first stir of divine intelligence, the awareness that turns back to contemplate the source. Aletheia was the truth revealed in that contemplation, radiant and undeniable. If Bethos and Sije were silence, Nous and Aletheia were the first whisper of meaning within that silence. Next came Logos and Zoe, reason and life. Logos was not mere speech, but the ordering principle of all things, the pattern behind the cosmos. Zoe was vitality itself, the current of divine life that animates all being. Together, they expressed harmony, order infused with vitality, structure alive with spirit. Finally, the Ogdoad was completed by Anthropos and Ecclesia, divine humanity and spiritual unity. Anthropos was the archetype of humanity, not flesh and blood, but consciousness made in the image of divinity. Ecclesia was the gathering of souls, the union of many into one. Together, they represented the sacred potential of humanity, to reflect the fullness, to reunite with the source. The observer pauses to note how startling this is. At the very root of divine being, humanity was already envisioned, not as an afterthought, not as clay shaped from dust, but as an aeon, a principle of the divine mind itself. In this vision, to be human was not to be fallen by default, but to carry within oneself the pattern of fullness. Beyond the Ogdoad stretched the Decad, the next ring of Aeons. Here, divine qualities became more differentiated, more varied. Theos, will, paired with synesis, understanding, together forming the drive of the source to express itself and the wisdom to give that expression shape. Charis, grace with agape love, one radiating generosity, the other pouring forth selfless unity. Pistis, faith, with Elpis, hope, one the trust that transcends evidence, the other the longing that pulls the soul toward its origin. Irene, peace, with Dikaiosune, justice, one the stillness of perfect order, the other the measure that sustains balance. Hagiosune, holiness, with Metriotes, moderation, one sacred purity, the other proportion, the law of balance that keeps all things in harmony. In the Decad, one sees qualities that later religions would praise as virtues. But here, they were not commands to be obeyed or ideals to be strived for. They were beings, realities, aeons. Faith was not something you held, it was a living presence. Love was not something you gave, it was an aeon pouring itself into being. Peace was not a fragile arrangement between nations, but the eternal stillness of a divine principle. Finally came the Dodecad, the 12 Aeons nearest the boundary. These were the most differentiated, shimmering at the edge of Pleroma. Here we find Monogenes, the only begotten, paired with Parakletos, the comforter. Macaria, blessedness, with Akhenatos, immovability, Gnosis, unity with synkresis, communion, Anapausis, rest, with Eusebia, reverence. Thanasis, revelation, with Eclaipsis, withdrawal. And at the very edge, Sophia, wisdom, often paired with Christos, the radiance of restoration. Sophia stood apart. She was the youngest of the Aeons, the last ripple of the monad's overflow. To her was given not mere reflection, but longing, a yearning to know the source directly. And it was in this yearning that the balance of the Pleroma would fracture. But that comes later. For now, she stands radiant among the others, embodying wisdom at the boundary where fullness meets the unknown. Scholars still debate whether the Valentinian system was purely symbolic or whether its architects truly believed in 30 distinct aeons. Some see it as a mythic code, mapping virtues and cosmic principles into a pattern of 30. Others argue that for the Gnostics, the aeons were more than symbols. They were living realities, just beyond the veil of matter. What is certain is that the Gnostics believed this system explained both the perfection of the divine and the brokenness of the world. For if 30 aeons formed a circle of harmony, then any disruption within that circle could send ripples of imbalance into creation itself. The observer reflects that this arrangement is both beautiful and fragile. Like a stained glass window, 30 panes of light, each distinct, each necessary. Remove one, and the harmony collapses. Strain one, and cracks spread across the whole. This was the risk at the heart of the Pleroma. Perfection was complete, yet its completeness pressed outward, always at risk of fracture. The system of Aeons, then, was not just cosmology. It was myth as philosophy, a way of explaining why the world contains both wisdom and folly, both truth and illusion. For within the circle of fullness, one Aeon, Sophia, would reach too far, and in reaching would give birth to something that should never have been. But that moment has not yet come. For now, the Pleroma still shines. 30 Aeons dwelling in unbroken harmony, a fullness beyond the grasp of time. Every architecture has its foundation. Every harmony begins with its opening notes. In the Gnostic vision, the Aeons did not emerge all at once, but in unfolding tiers, each more expansive than the last. The first of these was called the Ogdoad. 8 Aeons arranged in 4 syzygies, rippling closest to the monad itself. They were the primal expressions of the source, the seed pattern of everything that would follow. The observer turns to these first emanations, as if gazing into a mirror polished by silence. The first pair was Bythos and Sige, depth and silence. Bythos was the fathomless abyss, the unmeasurable vastness of being. Not darkness, not emptiness, but an infinite depth beyond comprehension. To speak of Bythos was to confront the impossibility of grasping the monad. He was the first ripple of the unknowable source, the bottomless ocean of existence. His counterpart was Sige, silence, the stillness that precedes all thought, the quiet that allows meaning to emerge. Silence was not absence, but fullness unspoken, the pregnant hush before the first word. Together, depth and silence embodied the mystery of the monad itself. One infinite, one ineffable. They were the threshold qualities, the veil of reverence through which all else would pass. From them came the second syzygy, Nous and Aletheia, mind and truth. Nous was the divine intellect, the first act of contemplation. He looked back toward the monad and reflected it. Aletheia, truth, was what that contemplation revealed, the shining certainty that emerges when awareness turns toward its source. Mind and truth were inseparable. Thought without truth is illusion. Truth without mind is unrecognized. In their union, the monad became self-aware through its emanations. The third syzygy was Logos and Zoe, reason and life. Logos was the ordering principle, the rational structure that underlies all things. In him was the pattern of speech, of proportion, of cosmic law. But without Zoe, his partner, he would be structure without vitality. Zoe was the living current, the spiritual vitality that animates the cosmos. Life made reason pulse, made order breathe. Together, Logos and Zoe embodied the harmony of order infused with spirit. The fourth syzygy was Anthropos and Ecclesia, humanity and unity. Anthropos was not humanity as flesh and history, but as archetype, the ideal human, consciousness formed in the image of the divine. Ecclesia was the gathering of souls, the unity of many into one body. Together they symbolized humanity's destiny, to reflect the divine and to return in unity to the fullness. Here the observer pauses, struck by the audacity of this vision. At the very heart of divine reality, before matter, before stars, before even time, there was already a place for humanity. Not as dust sculpted from earth, not as servants bent in obedience, but as a principle within the Pleroma itself. To be human in this myth was not to be cast out by default, but to be included from the beginning. The Ogdoad, then, formed the seed of the Pleroma. Depth and silence gave mystery its roots. Mind and truth gave awareness its reflection. Reason and life gave structure its breath. Humanity and unity gave destiny its shape. Together, they were the first ripples of fullness, the primordial chorus in which the monad found its expression. Some scholars have compared the Ogdoad to the first notes of a scale, setting the tone for all that would follow. Others have seen in it a reflection of philosophical traditions, depth and silence echoing Plato's realm of the unspoken, mind and truth reflecting the logos of Stoicism, humanity and unity, resonating with early Christian ideas of the body of Christ. And yet, the Gnostics themselves seemed unconcerned with borrowing or defending originality. To them, these were revelations, insights into the true order of reality, glimpsed in visions and preserved in myth. The Ogdoad was not static but alive. Its syzygies spiraled, interwove, resonated. One can imagine it as a circle of mirrors, each reflecting the source, each reflecting one another. Depth reflects silence, which reflects mind, which reflects truth, which reflects reason, which reflects life, which reflects humanity, which reflects unity. And so the circle continues, endless. In the language of story, the Ogdoad was the opening act. The characters introduced here were not heroes or villains, but archetypes, forces beyond time. They set the stage, but they did not yet move the plot. They were balance itself. In their stillness, there was no fracture, no fall, only fullness. But the observer knows that myths do not linger in balance forever. In every tradition, there comes a turning, a mistake, a yearning that tips perfection into motion. The Ogdoad was complete, but it was also only the beginning. From its harmony, more aeons would ripple outward, first the decad, then the dodecad. The further the emanations extended from the monad, the closer they drew to the boundary of the Pleroma, and the further they drew from the source, the more fragile the harmony became. Yet before that fragility, before the fracture, one must honor the foundation. The Ogdoad stands as the first echo of the monad. Depth beyond depth, silence beyond silence. Thought knowing truth, reason alive with spirit, humanity united in destiny. The Gnostics taught that these were not mere ideas, but presences. That when you experience truth, when you breathe life, when you glimpse unity, you are touching the resonance of the Ogdoad. And perhaps that is why the myth still lingers. For who has not felt moments of truth so radiant, it seems beyond words? Who has not felt life pulse with such intensity that it seems divine? Who has not longed for unity so profound that it dissolves separation? These are not accidents, the Gnostics said. They are echoes of the Aeons, ripples of the first emanations that still stir the soul. The Ogdoad was the beginning of those echoes, the first ripples in the ocean of the Pleroma, the foundation upon which the forgotten gods stood, waiting, luminous, silent. If the Ogdoad was the foundation, the first 8 Aeons nearest the source, then the next tier was the Decad, 10 Aeons arranged in 5 syzygies. Where the Ogdoad reflected mystery and archetype, the Decad unfolded qualities more recognizable to human experience: will, love, hope, justice, peace. It was here, in the second unfolding of the Pleroma, that the fullness began to shimmer with dimensions that would later echo through human virtues. The observer imagines this moment like the widening of ripples. The first waves are deep and solemn, depth and silence, mind and truth. But as the water spreads, the ripples touch shores closer to human comprehension. The Decad was the Pleroma, speaking in a language that humans could almost understand. The first syzygy of the Decad was Thetos and Synesis, will and understanding. Thetos represented the pure volition of the source, the impulse to express, not out of lack, but out of fullness. Synesis, understanding, was the receptive partner, shaping that will with insight, giving direction to its expression. Without understanding, will would be blind force. Without will, understanding would remain potential. Together, they formed the principle of purposeful creation, the energy of expression wedded to comprehension. The second pair was Charis and Agape, grace and love. Charis radiated generosity, the unearned outpouring of benevolence. Agape was love in its highest sense, selfless and transcendent, binding all things together. In their union, the Pleroma revealed its heart. Grace without love would be gift without bond. Love without grace would be longing without generosity. Together, they were the embrace of the divine, the warmth of fullness overflowing. The third syzygy was Pistis and Elpis, faith and hope. Pistis was trust, the deep knowing that surpasses evidence. Elpis was the forward-looking yearning, the anticipation of reunion with the source. To the Gnostics, faith was not belief in propositions, but a resonance with truth itself. Hope was not wishful thinking, but the inner call toward restoration. In their union, faith anchored the soul, while hope drew it forward. The fourth pair was Irene and Dikaiosune, peace and justice. Irene was stillness, harmony, the cessation of conflict in the balance of all things. Dikaiosune was fairness. The principle that ensured balance was maintained. Together, they were the architecture of harmony. Peace as the condition, justice as the structure. Without justice, peace would be fragile. Without peace, justice would be relentless. Together, they mirrored the monad's equilibrium. The final syzygy of the Decad was Hagiosune and Metriotes, holiness and moderation. Hagiosune was purity, the untouchable essence of the sacred. Metriotes was balance, proportion, the refusal of excess. Together, they formed the law of measure, the principle that sanctity resides in right proportion. Theirs was a harmony that avoided distortion, the golden mean of the divine. The Decad, then, was the flowering of virtues. Where the Ogdoad was mystery, depth, silence, truth, life, archetypal humanity, The decad unfolded qualities that human beings could glimpse in their own lives: will, love, faith, peace, holiness. These were not merely moral ideals, but living presences in the Pleroma. The observer notes that this vision reverses the way most traditions think about virtues. In human religions, virtues are commands. You must love. You must have faith. You must pursue justice. But for the Gnostics, virtues were not tasks. They were aeons. Love was not something you achieved, but something you touched when your soul resonated with agape. Faith was not a fragile belief, but an aeon already alive within the fullness. Justice was not the verdict of a court, but the eternal presence of balance in the divine. To walk in virtue, then, was not to obey, but to remember. It was to align with the echoes of the decad, still reverberating in the human soul. Scholars have long debated whether the decad was influenced by Platonic or Stoic thought. Plato spoke of virtues as forms, eternal and perfect, mirrored in the world of appearances. The Stoics saw virtues as the alignment of human reason with cosmic reason. The Gnostics transformed these philosophical currents into living myth. Instead of abstract forms or rational principles, they spoke of aeons, living emanations of the source, dwelling in the Pleroma, yet whispering into the human heart. The decad was also significant because it marked a widening distance from the monad. The Ogdoad was nearest to the source: mystery, mind, truth. The decad extended further, toward differentiation. Here, the qualities of fullness became more complex, more varied. The harmony was still intact, but the edges of tension began to glimmer. For the more the aeons differentiated, the more fragile their unity became, and yet the decad was luminous. It was the Pleroma expressing itself in virtues that could be recognized even in the broken world. When humans speak of grace, love, faith, hope, peace, justice, holiness, they are, knowingly or not, recalling the aeons of the decad. Each virtue is not invented but remembered, a resonance of the fullness still echoing in human souls. The observer imagines the decad as a great second ring of light, encircling the Ogdoad. The first ring is solemn, archetypal, rooted in mystery. The second ring is radiant, glowing with qualities that draw the human heart. Like stained glass, the decad casts its colors into the lower world. And even in the shadows of matter, one can glimpse them faintly: acts of grace, flashes of love, moments of justice. But harmony, as always in myth, cannot remain unbroken. Beyond the decad lay the final circle, the dodecad, 12 aeons at the edge of the Pleroma. Here, differentiation reached its height. Here, the resonance of fullness thinned into fragility. And here, in the youngest of the Aeons, Sophia, a longing would stir that would shatter the harmony. For now, the decad stands complete, radiant with the presences of will and understanding, grace and love, faith and hope, peace and justice, holiness and moderation. 10 aeons, 5 syzygies, the second unfolding of the monad's fullness. They do not command, they do not judge, they do not intervene. They simply are, and in their being, they leave echoes that the human soul still hears, though often faintly, as if through a veil. The Pleroma had unfolded in layers. First the Ogdoad, then the decad, each ripple carrying the fullness further outward. But no harmony lasts forever. At the farthest edge, where the radiance of the monad thinned into the boundary of mystery, stood the dodecad, 12 aeons, 6 syzygies, the final circle of emanations. Here the story of the aeons reached its most delicate point. For in this ring, perfection itself leaned against the veil of its own undoing. The observer imagines the dodecad like the outermost petals of a great flower, Closest to the stem, the ogdoad, the petals are strong and symmetrical. Further out, in the decad, the petals widen, glowing with color. At the very edge, in the dodecad, the petals are thin, translucent, fragile. They shimmer with beauty, yet are vulnerable to the wind. The first pair of this final circle was Monogenes and Parakletos, the only begotten and the advocate. Monogenes was singularity, the unique self-aware essence of the source, a mirror of its unity. Parakletos was comfort, intercession, the presence that draws the lost back toward the light. One embodied the divine aloneness, the other the gentle call to return. Next came Macaria and Akinetos, blessedness and immovability. Macaria radiated serenity, the joy of perfection untroubled by change. Akinetos was firmness, the immovable ground of divine certainty. Together, they represented stability, the peace that cannot be shaken, the blessed state that endures beyond decay. The third syzygy was Gnosis and Syncresis, unity and communion. Gnosis was the call to oneness, the force that draws all things back into a single whole. Syncresis was communion, the bond that makes unity possible, the shared participation that dissolves separation. Their union was the magnetic pull of the Pleroma itself, the gravity of wholeness. The fourth pair was Anapausis and Eusebia, rest and reverence. Anapausis was the stillness beyond striving, the peace of completion. Eusebia was reverence, devotion not born of fear but of love, the honoring of what is sacred. Rest and reverence together offer the assurance that fullness is not chaos but tranquility, not pride but awe. The fifth syzygy was Phonesis and Eclaipsis, revelation and withdrawal. Phonesis was unveiling, the sudden disclosure of hidden truth. Eclaipsis was concealment, the retreat of the divine into mystery. Together, they embodied the rhythm of presence and absence. Truth revealed, truth hidden. They were the pulse of divine revelation, never given all at once, never entirely withheld. And finally, the sixth pair, the most fateful of all, Sophia and Christos, wisdom and radiance. Sophia was the youngest of the Aeons, the final ripple, luminous yet restless. Christos was balance, restoration, the radiant order that heals fracture. Together they symbolized the tension at the heart of the Pleroma, the yearning to know and the power to restore. The observer lingers here, sensing the shift. The ogdoad had been solemn mystery, the decad harmonious virtue. The dodecad shimmered with paradox, comfort beside loneliness, serenity beside immovability, unity beside communion, rest beside reverence, revelation beside withdrawal, wisdom beside radiance. Each pair held within it a tension, a fragility, a suggestion that perfection was not static but dynamic, always balancing on the edge of possibility. It was in this dynamic tension that something would break. For Sophia, wisdom was unlike the others. As the youngest Aeon, she stood at the very boundary of the Pleroma, nearest to the veil that separated fullness from the hollow beyond. And in her burned a longing no other Aeon had felt, a yearning to know the monad directly, to grasp what was meant to remain unknowable. Not in rebellion, not in arrogance, but in holy curiosity. In her desire, the harmony of the Pleroma trembled. But that belongs to the next part of the story. For now, the dodecad remains radiant. 12 eons, 6 syzygies, the outer ring of fullness. Theirs was a beauty tinged with fragility, a harmony that seemed almost too perfect, too delicate to endure. The Gnostics understood this as the natural order. The further the emanations stretched from the source, the more vulnerable they became. Scholars still debate whether the Dodecad was ever meant as literal cosmology or as mythic metaphor. Some interpret it as a symbolic psychology, wisdom at the edge of consciousness, longing to know the depths of the self. Others see it as metaphysics, a grand system describing actual realms of existence beyond time. Still others dismiss it as poetic speculation, a myth spun from fragments of Plato, Judaism, and mystery religions. Yet what matters in myth is not the ledger of fact, but the resonance of meaning. And the Dodecad resonates with the sense that perfection itself holds the seed of fracture, that wisdom longs, that revelation conceals, that unity requires communion, that rest demands reverence. The observer reflects that perhaps this is why the myth feels hauntingly human. For who among us has not felt wisdom tinged with restlessness? Who has not glimpsed truth only for it to withdraw again? Who has not longed for unity yet found it fragile? The Dodecad, at the edge of fullness, mirrors the human soul at the edge of its own comprehension. And yet, it was not destined to remain intact. Sophia's longing would push beyond the limit. The veil between Pleroma and the hollow beyond would tremble. And from that trembling would come a new being, blind and arrogant, who would mistake himself for the source. But for now, the Dodecad gleams in its fragile perfection, the last circle of Aeons, the final ripples before the fracture. Every myth that endures contains within it a fracture, a moment when perfection bends, when balance falters, when harmony leans too far toward dissonance. In the story of the Aeons, that fracture was not born of malice, nor rebellion, nor violence. It began instead with longing. And the one who longed was Sophia. Sophia, whose very name means wisdom, was the youngest of the Aeons, the last ripple of the monad's overflow. Dwelling at the outermost circle of the Pleromas, she was radiant, luminous, complete, and yet her position was perilous. For the further an Aeon stood from the source, the thinner the resonance became, the closer one came to the boundary where fullness trembled against emptiness. Sophia lived at that edge, where perfection thinned into possibility, where harmony brushed against fragility. The observer sees her not as a goddess in human form, but as a flame trembling at the edge of a lamp. Within her was the reflection of the monad, yet unlike her elder siblings, she turned her gaze inward. The other Aeons had accepted their role, to reflect, to resonate, to harmonize. Sophia, however, desired something more. She yearned not only to reflect the monad, but to know it. Not through her consort, not through the harmony of syzygy, but directly, face to face, essence to essence. Why did she long? The Gnostics never gave a single answer. Some said it was the holy curiosity of wisdom itself, seeking to know its origin. Others whispered it was loneliness, the ache of being the youngest, the farthest, always at the boundary. Still others saw in her longing a mirror of the human condition, the desire of the soul to pierce the veil, to see the source without mediation. Whatever the reason, Sophia's desire was pure, yet perilous. For in the Pleroma, there was an unspoken law. The monad was unknowable. It could be reflected, mirrored, emanated, but never grasped. To attempt to seize it directly was to strain the fabric of harmony. The Aeons were fullness, but the monad was beyond fullness. To reach for it without balance was to invite fracture. And yet, Sophia reached. The observer imagines the moment as a tremor, a ripple in the still waters of the Pleroma. Where all other Aeons reflected, Sophia leaned forward. Where all others rested in harmony, Sophia stretched beyond. Her longing was not rebellion. was devotion. But devotion, too, can become imbalance when it breaks the pattern of order. In her yearning, Sophia acted alone. Unlike the other Aeons, who existed in pairs, she reached without her syzygy, without balance. This solitude was the first wound. Her desire was so great that it overflowed, not with harmony, but with fracture. And from that overflow, something new was born, not an Aeon, not a reflection of fullness, but a distortion. This distortion would take form as the Demiurge, the blind craftsman who believed himself supreme. But before that, there was the moment of rupture itself, the grief of wisdom. Sophia, in her longing, had strained the veil of the Pleroma, and in straining she fell. The Gnostics told this moment in many ways. Some said Sophia was cast out, her radiance too unstable to remain in the fullness. Others said she fell willingly, choosing exile in order to guide what would come. Still others described her as torn in two, one aspect remaining in the Pleroma, the other descending into the lower realms. However it was told, the meaning was the same. Wisdom's longing opened the door to a flawed creation. The observer reflects that this is no ordinary myth of rebellion. In Greek stories, Prometheus defies the gods out of pride or compassion. In Christian tales, Lucifer falls through arrogance. But Sophia's longing was not arrogance. It was a hunger for intimacy, for knowledge, for union with the unknowable. Her fall was not a crime, but a heartbreak. It was love reaching too far. And yet, it was enough to shake the cosmos. What followed was sorrow. Sophia, seeing what her longing had wrought, was overwhelmed by grief. She had desired the source, but instead she gave rise to fracture. She had reached for fullness, but her hand closed on shadow. The Gnostics often described her weeping, her tears becoming the seeds of creation. The world that resulted was not the luminous Pleroma, but a dim reflection, an imitation without substance. Still, Sophia did not abandon what had emerged. Some versions of the myth say she begged the higher Aeons for restoration, and in answer, Christ, the radiant Aeon, was sent to heal the fracture. Others say Sophia herself descended, dwelling within the flawed creation to guide the sparks of divine light hidden there. In either case, Sophia's story is not one of simple failure, but of compassion, of grief turned to redemption. Scholars have long debated the meaning of Sophia's longing. Was it a parable of human desire, warning that to seek the infinite too directly is to fall into illusion? Was it an allegory for the limits of knowledge? The recognition that some mysteries cannot be solved without breaking the very conditions of understanding? Or was it, as some mystics insisted, a truth about the soul itself? That within each human is a fragment of Sophia's yearning. A restless wisdom knows this world is not enough. The observer does not answer, but watches, letting the myth speak. For Sophia's longing is not just a tale of the past. It is a mirror. When you look at the stars and feel that they are not your true home, that is Sophia. When you search for meaning beyond the world's hollow patterns, that is Sophia. When you ache for something infinite, something that cannot be named, that is Sophia. Her longing is alive in every human soul, a memory of the Pleroma pressing against the prison of matter. At the edge of fullness, Sophia longed. At the edge of silence, she strained to hear the voice of the source. And in that moment of longing, the story of the Aeons changed forever. For from her yearning would come the Demiurge, and from the Demiurge the world we now inhabit. A cosmos both beautiful and broken, radiant yet hollow, a palace shaped like a prison. But that belongs to the next chapter. For now, the myth pauses in grief, as if holding its breath. Sophia's longing burned still, a holy ache that cannot be quenched, a flame at the boundary of perfection. From Sophia's longing came imbalance, and from imbalance came rupture. What she brought forth was not like the Aeons. No radiant harmony, no syzygy, no reflection of fullness. It was a being formed in solitude, without balance, without clear vision of the source. And because it was cut off from the Pleroma, it mistook itself as the origin. Thus was born the Demiurge. The Demiurge was no villain in the mythic sense. He was not a demon with horns or a tyrant clothed in shadow. He was something more unsettling, a craftsman who believed himself to be God. Born from the fractured yearning of Sophia, he carried power, but power distorted by ignorance. He was strong, creative, forceful, but blind. The observer sees him like a child waking in a dark room, never having seen the sun, yet convinced that his own flickering lantern is the only light that has ever been. The Demiurge knew nothing of the monad. He had never seen the fullness. Cut off from the resonance of the Aeons, he assumed that he alone existed, that he alone had authority. His blindness was his arrogance. The Gnostics described him with many names. Some called him Yaldabaoth, the child of chaos. Others called him Saklas, the fool, or Samael, the blind god. Each name captured the same truth. He was powerful but ignorant, a being born of distortion who mistook himself for the source. And yet, blind though he was, he began to create. For in him burned a spark of Sophia's essence, the residue of her divine longing. That spark gave him the power to shape, to order, to bring forth. But because he was cut off from the Pleroma, what he shaped was flawed, an imitation of the fullness without its radiance. The Demiurge set about his task like a craftsman constructing a palace. He gathered the raw materials of chaos and forged them into structures. Stars, planets, seas, skies. He shaped them all, but not with the wisdom of the Aeons. His creation was patterned after echoes he could not fully grasp, like a shadow artist copying shapes he had never seen clearly. The result was a cosmos, vast, orderly, magnificent in appearance, yet hollow in essence. The Gnostics called this cosmos a prison, not because it was without beauty. The night sky still dazzled, the mountains still inspired awe, the seas still roared with majesty, but because it lacked the spark of fullness. It was form without substance, image without essence. The Demiurge built a palace, but it was a palace shaped like a cage. The observer notes that this myth is unlike most creation stories. In many traditions, the world is born from the will of God, and its imperfection is blamed on human sin or fate. But in the Gnostic story, the flaw runs deeper. The world itself was not born of fullness, but of fracture. Its beauty is a copy, its order a shadow. It dazzles the senses, but behind its walls there is always an echo of absence. And yet, the Demiurge did not see it this way. In his blindness, he proclaimed himself the only God. "There is none beside me," he declared, unaware that he was but a distorted reflection of Sophia's overflow. His arrogance was not malice, but ignorance, the certainty of one who has never glimpsed what lies beyond. To enforce his rule, the Demiurge fashioned helpers, beings the Gnostics called Archons, rulers of the cosmos. These Archons governed the stars, the planets, the laws of fate. They were wardens of the prison, ensuring that the sparks of divine light scattered in matter would remain bound. Each soul born into the world carried within it a fragment of Sophia's essence. But the Archons wrapped those sparks in illusion, binding them with law, with fear, with distraction, with death. Thus the world we inhabit was formed, a structure both radiant and flawed, beautiful yet deceptive. The heavens stretched in orderly patterns, the earth yielded its fruits, the cycles of time repeated with precision. To the Demiurge, this was perfection. To the Gnostics, it was a trap. Sophia, seeing what had been born of her longing, was overcome with grief. Some myths say she wept, her tears falling into the cosmos, mingling with matter. Others say she descended into the lower realms herself, choosing to remain near her creation, hoping to guide the sparks of light trapped within it. In either case, her sorrow was woven into the fabric of the world. Every human ache, every sense of exile, every longing for something beyond the visible was, to the Gnostics, the echo of Sophia's grief. The observer considers how strange and how haunting this story remains. It does not flatter humanity with the idea of a perfect world. Instead, it insists that the dissonance we feel, the sense that something is not quite right, that the world is both beautiful and broken, is not failure of perception, but a truth. The cosmos is a copy. Behind its order lies absence. Behind its beauty lies fracture. The Demiurge shaped it, but he could not give it fullness. And yet, there is hope even here. For in his ignorance, the Demiurge could not extinguish the sparks of Sophia's essence that were scattered into matter. Each human soul carried within it a fragment of divine light, a memory of the Pleroma, a whisper of fullness. Though trapped by the Archons, though veiled by illusion, these sparks remained. And it was through them that the Aeons could still reach, faintly, across the veil. The birth of the Demiurge, then, was not merely a fall, but the beginning of a struggle. Between ignorance and remembrance. Between blindness and awakening. Between the prison shaped like a palace and the fullness that waits beyond. The Gnostics saw this not only as cosmology, but as diagnosis. When you feel that the world is out of joint, that beauty is tinged with sorrow, that truth is hidden beneath layers of illusion, you are not mistaken. You are feeling the weight of the Demiurge's cosmos, the shadow of Sophia's fall. But within that sorrow burns a spark, the possibility of awakening, of gnosis, of remembering that this world is not the end. Thus, the Demiurge was born, not evil in the simple sense, but blind, arrogant, ignorant, a craftsman who built the world without knowing the fullness, who mistook his palace for the true reality. His rule was strong, his cosmos vast, but his power could never extinguish the echo of Sophia's light. And it is that light, hidden in every soul, that waits still for remembrance. The Demiurge, blind yet powerful, set his hands to shaping. He did not know the Pleroma, yet some fragment of Sophia's light lived within him, and with it he forged the world. He built with confidence, arranging stars into patterns, spreading out heavens above, gathering waters below, forming land, creatures, and laws of motion. To him, this was glory. To him, this was perfection. To him, it proved his supremacy. But the Gnostics told it differently. They said, "Look closer." The Demiurge's world was not perfection, it was imitation. It resembled the Pleroma in form, but not in essence. It had structure, but no fullness. Beauty, but no permanence. It glittered with light, but the light was not its own. The cosmos he fashioned was a palace, but a palace built as a prison. The observer imagines this palace, marble walls gleaming, halls vast, pillars rising high, chandeliers dazzling with borrowed fire. At first glance, magnificent. But within, every door is locked, every window barred, every corridor looping back on itself. It is a design not to liberate, but to contain. That, said the Gnostics, was our world. The Demiurge, however, could not see it. He proclaimed himself the only God. "I am the Lord, and there is none beside me," he declared in blindness. To him, the cosmos was his masterpiece, and humanity his crowning achievement. He believed himself benevolent. He believed his laws just. But ignorance laced every corner of his creation, and arrogance filled every decree. In his ignorance, he created Archons, rulers of the spheres, wardens of the prison. They governed the planets, the constellations, the cycles of time. Fate itself, the Gnostics said, was their chain. The Archons enforced order with precision, yet their order was bondage. Birth, labor, death, return. The cycle repeated, not to liberate souls, but to keep them trapped. Like guards in towers, the Archons stood watch, ensuring no spark of light escaped. And yet, within each human soul, that spark still lived. Sophia's essence, scattered in the act of her longing, had become seeds buried in matter. Each body carried one, each soul bore a flicker of the divine. But the Demiurge did not see them as divine. To him, humanity was clay, shaped by his hand, breathing at his command. He did not realize that what moved within them was older and higher than himself. This is why the Gnostics looked at the world and saw a paradox. On the surface, it was ordered, vast, magnificent. But beneath, it was flawed, fragile, impermanent. Mountains crumbled, stars died, kingdoms fell. Even beauty withered. The palace gleamed, but the prison walls were real. The observer pauses to consider the resonance of this vision. To many, the world's suffering is explained by human sin, or by tests of faith, or by mysterious divine will. The Gnostics refused such answers. They said, "The flaw is not yours. It is in the foundation." The world itself was shaped by a blind hand. Its beauty is undeniable, but its pain is inescapable. And this, they insisted, was why the human soul feels estranged, why no matter how much the world offers, it never feels whole. We are sparks of fullness trapped in imitation. In this palace prison, everything became law. Laws of nature, laws of kings, laws of survival. The Demiurge bound existence with chains disguised as order. The stars became calendars, the earth a marketplace, the body a cage. What looked like stability was confinement. What looked like justice was control. The Archons made sure of it, stamping seals, turning cycles, tightening bonds. But even in prison, memories stir. The Gnostics believed that the Aeons, though barred from entering the material realm, could still send echoes across the veil. These echoes stirred the sparks within humanity, a dream that felt too real, a sudden flash of recognition, a longing that no wealth, no power, no pleasure could satisfy. These were reminders, not from gods demanding worship, but from Aeons reminding the soul of its origin. Scholars still argue about how literally the Gnostics believed this cosmology. Was the Demiurge truly an entity, or a mythic symbol for the ignorance woven into creation? Were the Archon spirits ruling the planets, or metaphors for systems of power, empires, institutions, hierarchies that bind the human spirit? The uncertainty lingers. But whether myth or metaphor, the image is haunting. A prison shaped like a palace, designed so perfectly that most never notice their chains. The observer reflects that perhaps this is why the story still resonates. Who has not looked at the world and felt the unease? Who has not noticed how beauty fades, how justice falters, how truth hides? Who has not felt that life, for all its wonder, is shadowed by something hollow? The Gnostics dared to name it. They said, "This hollowness is not illusion. It is the mark of a creation made without fullness. And yet, within this flawed world, hope remained. For the sparks of Sophia were still alive, scattered in every soul. The prison walls could not extinguish them. The Archons could not silence them. They burned quietly, waiting for the moment of remembrance." This, then, is the paradox of the Demiurge's world. Beautiful yet broken, orderly yet flawed, dazzling yet hollow. A palace that impresses the senses but imprisons the soul. A cosmos that mimics the Pleroma but lacks its radiance. And within it, humanity, bearing the secret that we are not of this palace, not of this prison, but of the fullness that lies beyond. The myth leaves us here, in the tension between magnificence and confinement, gazing at the palace walls and wondering if the door is locked from the inside, or if the key has always been within us. Every world has its boundaries. The ocean meets the shore, the sky bends into the horizon, the body finds its end in death. Boundaries shape existence, giving it form and limit. But for the Gnostics, the greatest boundary was not of land or time. It was metaphysical, invisible, absolute. They called it the Horos, the great limit. The observer envisions Horos not as a wall of stone nor a gate of fire, but as a line of tension stretched across reality itself. On one side, the Pleroma, fullness, harmony, radiant balance. On the other, the Kenoma, emptiness, distortion, the restless turbulence of formless matter. The Horos was the seam between them, where perfection touched chaos and could go no further. The Aeons existed within the Pleroma, each a ripple of divine mind. None could pass beyond the Horos. To cross it would be to leave fullness behind, to step into hollowness where resonance collapses. The limit was not punishment, but necessity, an eternal safeguard. Yet Sophia, in her longing, had strained against it, and in straining, she tore a hole, however slight, through which fracture entered. The Gnostics described the Horos in many ways. Sometimes it was a curtain, a veil separating light from shadow. Sometimes a boundary stone, a cosmic marker between what is real and what is imitation. Sometimes it was personified as a guardian, standing watch to keep the realms apart. But whatever the image, its meaning was the same. Horos was the edge of fullness, beyond which lay inversion. On the far side of Horos stretched the Kenoma, the void, the hollow. Unlike the Pleroma, which was luminous harmony, the Kenoma was anxious turbulence. It was not creative, but derivative, not life, but imitation. Here form collapsed into distortion, permanence dissolved into decay. It was into this realm that Sophia's unintended emanation fell, and from it the Demiurge drew his materials. The world he shaped was not substance, but shadow, not radiance, but reflection. The observer notes how this vision reverses ordinary cosmology. Most traditions imagine creation springing from chaos into order. For the Gnostics, it was the opposite. Order already existed in the Pleroma, perfect and whole. Chaos came after, as an inversion of harmony. The material cosmos was not creation from nothing, but creation from lack, from distortion. And the Horos was the boundary that kept them apart. To the human mind, the Horos can feel familiar. It is that sense of limit in our own lives, the invisible line we cannot cross. The hunger for the infinite, pressed against the finitude of time. The yearning for perfection, confronted by imperfection. The desire for truth, tangled in illusions. In each of these, the soul feels the Horos. Not a wall of stone, but a veil in consciousness. The Gnostics taught that the Horos was not just cosmic, but internal. Each human soul carried within it a spark of the Pleroma. but that spark was bound by a veil of forgetfulness. To awaken was to thin that veil, to see through the Horos not as a barrier, but as a reminder. For though it could not be crossed by force, it could tremble at the touch of gnosis, knowledge that is remembrance. Some schools described Horos as twofold. From one angle, it was protection, preventing the chaos of the Pleroma from overwhelming the fullness of the Pleroma. From another, it was tragedy, keeping souls trapped in a world of imitation. Like glass, it separated two realms, one luminous, one hollow. And like glass, it was transparent enough that echoes could pass through, dreams, visions, sudden moments of awe, those strange flashes when the world feels paper thin and one senses something beyond. Scholars still puzzle over the origins of this concept. Some compare Horos to Plato's line between the world of forms and the world of appearances. Others see it as influenced by Jewish mysticism, where cherubim guard the way to Eden and the curtain of the temple conceals the Holy of Holies. Still others suggest it was experiential. The Gnostics felt in their own lives the tension between spirit and matter, and named that tension Horos. Whatever its source, it became central to their cosmology. The Demiurge and his Archons never passed the Horos. They ruled only the lower realm, weaving laws, binding souls, shaping the cosmos of matter. But the Aeons within the Pleroma could still send resonance across it, not by force, but by presence. To the Gnostics, the whispers of truth, the ache of beauty, the longing for wholeness. These were the resonance of the Aeons reaching through Horos, stirring sparks in the human soul. The observer imagines the Horos as a trembling veil, shimmering at the edge of perception. Most pass their lives never noticing it, absorbed in the palace prison of the Demiurge. But sometimes, in silence or sorrow, in wonder or grief, one feels the thinness of the world. One feels that reality itself quivers and something beyond is near. That quiver, the Gnostics said, is Horos trembling, and when it trembles, the illusion weakens. For a moment, the palace no longer dazzles. The chains no longer bind. The Archons lose their grip. In that moment, the soul remembers. It does not belong to the prison, but to the fullness beyond. Thus, the Horos is both barrier and beacon. It keeps the realms apart, yet it reminds the soul that there is more. It is the edge of perfection and the beginning of exile. To awaken is not to break through it, but to see it clearly, to know that what lies beyond the prison walls is not emptiness, but fullness waiting. In the myth of the Aeons, the Horos remains, the great limit, the eternal veil, the seam between harmony and distortion. Beyond it, the Demiurge rules his hollow cosmos. Within it, the Aeons dwell in radiant silence. And here, at the boundary, humanity lives, sparks of fullness veiled by matter, longing for what they have never seen, yet already know. Across the veil, the Aeons do not march. They do not speak in thunder. They resonate. Presence, not intrusion. A tone more felt than heard. A pressure on the surface of consciousness like a fingertip on still water. The observer notices how certain hours become porous. How in a museum's quiet hall, or on a bus at dusk when windows turn to mirrors, the world seems thinner than glass. Not a message precisely, but recognition. Ripples within ripples, answering ripples beyond. Because the Horos holds, the Aeons cannot cross. Yet resonance knows other paths. Aletheia does not send syllables. She sends that sudden lucidity when a lie collapses under its own weight. Zoe does not send visions. She sends the moment when breath feels larger than lungs, when life stands up inside a person like a flame. Charis arrives as unmerited softness in a hard room, Agape weaves a thread between strangers. Irene lowers the noise of a mind without demanding reasons. Dikaiosune presses on the scale when no judge is watching. Hagiosune rinses a motive clean before words form. The lower world calls these moods. The observer calls them echoes. A mainstream fact anchors the intuition. In 1945, near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, laborers unearthed a sealed jar of papyrus codices, Coptic translations of older texts that speak of Pleroma, Sophia, the Demiurge, and the secret knowledge that awakens remembrance. Pages that had been buried for centuries re-entered the light, their fibers crackling like dry reeds. It was as if an echo that had trembled across minds suddenly took on paper and ink, a resonance becoming artifact. The observer runs a finger along a line about fullness, and the line hums back. You already knew this. Not everyone hears the same pitch. Some wake in dreams where rooms have wrong angles and doors open into corridors of sky. Some feel it during music, an unresolved chord that somehow completes them. Some sense it in mathematics, where order appears not as invention, but discovery. A map of something that was there before anyone looked, as if Logos had breathed through symbols and left the air vibrating. Others brush it during grief, when the palace shows its bars and a quiet voice that is not their own refuses despair. The echo chooses its instruments, or perhaps the instruments choose to be tuned. Fringe language blooms in the margins. There are circles that whisper of planetary hours that thin the veil, of nights when certain alignments loosen the Archons' grip and dreams grow lucid. Others claim the jailers learned modern disguises, not iron helmets, but calendars, contracts, screens, systems that enforce attention as strictly as the old stars. The observer neither blesses nor banishes these tales, only notices how they keep appearing, like patterns that will not stop insisting. If the prison is shaped after a palace, perhaps the wardens prefer uniforms that look like invitations. Scholarly uncertainty shadows the echo like a faithful twin. Specialists argue whether Gnosticism names a coherent movement or a basket of rival schools, whether the Sophia drama is pre-Christian myth dressed in later robes, whether the figure of Christ in these texts is a cosmic Aeon or a poetic refraction of a historical teacher. Others dispute dating, dependence, intention. The debates do not kill the resonance, they map it. Questions, too, can be harbors. The observer lets them stand as markers along a coast, where fog and coastline agree to keep each other interesting. If resonance is how the Aeons reach, interference is how the Archons reply. Not a demon in the doorway, but 100 small insistences. An urgent email at the exact second a person is about to stand and step outside. A clock that shouts the arithmetic of scarcity. An algorithm that confuses appetite with attention. None of these are monstrous enough to fear. Together, they are heavy enough to forget. The observer has seen souls lulled by a lullaby of busyness, and others who slip a single ear free and hear, beneath the drone, a thinner music. One note, then two, from a room on the other side of the wall. And because this is the moment in the journey where echoes gather their brightest edge, a gentle intermission folds into the narrative without breaking the thread. If you have felt even a flicker of that brightness, if some phrase, some image of ripples or stained glass has stirred a resonance, then leave a small sign for the next traveler. Mark the trail. Subscribe, share, write a comment that names the note you heard. Not for numbers, but for navigation. Echoes find each other faster when the corridors are lit. Return now to the soft mechanics of remembrance. The Gnostics insisted that gnosis was not information, but awakening. The difference is not minor. Information adds, awakening reveals. The observer watches a woman in a library read a line about Sophia's grief and sees suddenly that her own life has been organized by a hunger that was not a flaw, but a compass. He watches a man on a night walk realize that the panic he calls meaninglessness is irritation at a key left inside the lock. The door not opened yet. No new data enters them. Something old stands up. Because echoes are contagious, art becomes a carrier. A painter who has never opened a codex paints a window that is not a window, a blue that is more like a sound. A poet whispers, "The world is wrong-shaped," and does not know she has summarized a century of cosmology in 5 words. A child builds a tower of blocks, then stops and places a single green leaf on the top as if to say, "Form should breathe." Logos nods. Zoe smile. There are, inevitably, resistances. "You're imagining patterns," a friend says kindly. "The world is enough," another insists. And the insistence is itself tender, as if he fears that naming the bars will make the room smaller. The observer honors the tenderness and keeps looking. The palace remains beautiful. The bars do not vanish because beauty is acknowledged. The echo does not vanish because kindness is offered. 2 truths can share a table. The tea cools between them. Sometimes the echo is fierce. Truth arranges a sudden mirror and a life splits, before and after. More often the echo is patient. It returns at the same hour for years, tapping the same place in the same wall, asking the same small question. "Do you remember?" The Archons learn to be patient too. They thicken commitments, stack fine print upon fine print. Yet the note returns, thinner and purer, a thread that cannot be legislated. The observer thinks of that jar at Nag Hammadi, how it slept beneath dust while empires traded banners above it, how a blade cracked clay and a small cloud of centuries lifted, how a man who could not read the words still felt their weight in his hands. The echo does not despise containers. It uses them. Bodies, books, breaths. What matters is the tremor in the reader, the listener, the passerby whose head turns at nothing perceptible and who later says, "I don't know why, but something changed." Call it coincidence if you like. Call it psychology. Call it the nervous system making patterns from noise. The observer will not quarrel. Names are docking bays. Ships can anchor under any of them. What matters is that the water under the hull keeps moving toward a tide. The harbor lights do not explain. In the next movement, the story will give the echo 2 faces, Christ and Sophia, as call and answer, descent and ascent, map and hunger. For now, let the resonance do its slow work. The palace is still here. The door is not yet open, but the key has warmed in the hand. When a room is too quiet, one whisper can govern it. In the Gnostic imagination, that whisper is Christ, not a throne-bound judge, but a tone that knows how to find the frequency of forgotten strings. If Sophia is the ache within the world, Christ is the answer sent from beyond it. If she is the flame at the edge of the lamp, he is the wind that leans close without extinguishing it. Together they form a grammar of salvation. Call and echo, descent and ascent, memory and longing completing one another across the Horos. The observer watches how the story bends here. Until now, the myth has moved outward, from monad to Aeons, to Sophia's fall, from palace to prison to limit. Now it turns inward. The rescue will not be a breach of walls, but a retuning of hearing. The palace remains. The bars remain. The key, too, remains where it has always been. inside the hand that forgot it was holding something. Christ's task in this telling is not to build a new door, but to teach the hand its shape again. A mainstream fact steadies the vision. In one canonical gospel written in the 1st century, Christ is named with a philosophical word already in circulation, logos, the word through whom all was ordered. Whether one reads this as poetry or metaphysics, the pairing is plain. The story of a teacher in Roman Palestine is laced to an ancient claim about cosmic reason. The Gnostics took that strand and braided it further. They spoke of Christ not only as a historical figure, but as an Aeon, a presence of the Pleroma who can cross the corridors of the lower realms the way light crosses stained glass, changed in color but not in nature. They said he descended not to repair the prison, but to wake the prisoners. His teachings were maps that fold into keys. The parables are codes hiding in plain sight, doorways disguised as stories about fields and lamps and lost coins. When he speaks of treasure buried in a field, the Gnostic listener hears a spark buried in a body. When he says the kingdom is within, the listener hears, the Pleroma is not far. Its resonance is carried in you. Fringe testimonies flourish around this descent. In some circles, Christ is described as slipping from heaven to earth through layers of rulers, taking on appearance without weight, as if footprints failed to bruise dust. In others, he is a shapeshifter of mercy, wearing whatever face a soul can bear, laughing in the rooms where fear expects solemnity, speaking in riddles that overthrow the Archons' grammar. The observer neither proves nor disproves these reports. He listens to the function they serve. Each tells the same secret. What saves you is not a heavier law, but a lighter step. The chains do not snap. They evaporate when you remember they were vapor painted to look like iron. Sophia's part in this is not silence. She is not merely the one who fell. She becomes the companion within, the wisdom that aches from inside the world, the pressure of meaning against the prison's inside wall. If Christ is the call from beyond the veil, Sophia is the echo already living in matter, answering from the far room. Yes, I hear you. She is grief and turning to guidance, loss reworked into lamp. In this synergy, salvation is stereo. What is spoken from the Pleroma finds its resonance in the heart still tangled in Canoma. It is here that scholarly uncertainty turns the gemstone in the light. Did these myths grow beside the earliest churches like a wild vine around a pillar, or after them as a reaction? Is the figure of Christ as Aeon a reimagining of a remembered teacher, or a cosmic symbol later clothing itself in a human biography? Are the Sophia dramas older stories adopted into a newer frame? Or are they inventions woven to answer questions the canonical texts left open? The archive cannot force a single verdict. Manuscripts arrive late, memories are braided, schools disagree. The observer lets the debate stand like boundary stones. They do not fence the myth in, but they keep us honest about the fog. Meanwhile, the narrative itself remains clear about its therapy. The Demiurge rules by boasting. Christ undoes by unveiling. The Archons bind by repetition. Christ loosens by surprise. He tells a story, and in the telling, moves a hinge the listener did not know was a hinge. He eats with those whose names the wardens file under unworthy, and thus declassifies the category. He refuses the theater where power rehearses itself, and in that refusal halts the rehearsal. He says, wake more often than he says obey, and when waking begins, the world changes tone without changing shape. Bread is still bread, but it tastes like participation. Water is still water, but it drinks like a promise. Sorrow does not evaporate, but it widens, like a window no longer confused for a wall. The observer has seen a person set down a grievance and discover that their fingers are free for the first time to touch the lock that grievance guarded. Not forgiveness imposed, but recognition. This door was always inside the room. There is a tenderness in how the myth lets Christ and Sophia share the work. He descends as memory, she rises as desire. He names what is true, she teaches the body to recognize the name. He cuts patterns in speech, she traces them into habit. He is the light that does not break the lamp. She is the oil that learns to burn with it. This is why the Gnostics called salvation gnosis, not new information, but a recovery of acquaintance. One does not collect facts about the sun. One steps outside and remembers light. Still, the palace prison does not clap for this. Systems prefer obedience to awakening. The Archons replace old chains with new incentives. They rename the bars career, tribe, feed, trend, and call it kindness that you need never be alone. The myth is not embarrassed to say that even religion can be borrowed for this work. Forms calcify, rules thicken. The palace acquires a chapel and calls it scheduled devotion. Christ does not burn the chapel down. He opens a side door. Sophia does not condemn the schedule. She oils the hinges. Together, they leave the door slightly, scandalously ajar. A fact returns to ground, the airy. Whatever else may be argued, there were communities in the 1st and 2nd centuries who sang the name of Christ under Roman skies, copied sayings, broke bread, buried their dead with hope, and argued fiercely sometimes about meaning. Among the arguments was this one: is salvation a contract kept or a knowing remembered? The Gnostic answer leans toward knowing, not as arrogance, but as homecoming. So the observer sets this scene plainly: a world bright and hollow, a wisdom that aches within it, a word that enters it without becoming small. On a street no one records, a woman hears a teaching and feels not conviction, but familiarity, as if someone were pronouncing her true name in a language she never learned but always knew. On a hillside, a man laughs at a sentence he has never heard before, not because it is witty, but because it abolishes something inside him that was never real. Across 1,000 ordinary rooms, lamps are lit, and for a minute, shadows forget their choreography. Call and echo, descent and ascent. The palace remains, the prison remains, the key warms in the hand. Christ's work is to remind the hand of the turning it can do. Sophia's work is to want the door open so badly that when it finally swings, the room already knows what to do with the light. The palace was always too bright to notice the bars. But once the whisper of Christ and the ache of Sophia join into harmony, the walls tremble. For the first time, the prisoners glance not only at the gilded ceilings, but at the locks in the corners. The myth sharpens here into confrontation, not of armies, but of atmospheres. The Archons, once unnoticed as the background hum of law and custom, are now revealed as keepers of the masquerade. Their rule was always fragile. It survived by being invisible. Awareness is a mutiny. The observer describes them with care, not demons with horns, but administrators of illusion. In earlier centuries, people associated them with planetary spheres: Saturn, Mars, Venus, celestial towers that gate souls descending to Earth. Each Archon was said to brand the soul with a weight, a habit, a chain. Saturn gave heaviness, Mars violence, Venus craving. To pass upward again was to unhook these seals, to return each borrowed mask and step naked into the light. In later imaginations, the Archons shed planets and put on subtler skins. Bureaucracies, currencies, entertainments, scrolls without end. If once they measured years in stars, now they measure minutes in screens. A mainstream anchor clarifies the frame. In the codices of Nag Hammadi, names of Archons are listed: Yaldabaoth, Sabaoth, Yao, Astaphios, Eloios, Horios. Some are echoes of biblical angels, others of Mesopotamian powers, woven into a new tapestry. Scholars still argue whether these names were inherited myths or satirical masks placed on the rulers of the age. Were the Archons ancient gods recast as jailers? Or were they metaphors for oppressive systems, given divine-sounding titles to expose their vanity? The debate continues like a low percussion beneath the narrative. But to the myth itself, the Archons are more than metaphors. They are the hands that tighten forgetfulness. They sow confusion not by grand assault, but by nudging. A thought arrives. You are only matter. A rule repeats, you are only role. A rhythm insists, the schedule is your shape. The observer notices how this works in practice. A man wakes to a strange, clarifying dream. By breakfast, his inbox has erased it. A child feels awe at stars. By adolescence, the awe is filed under astronomy homework. An artist touches transcendence in color. The marketplace rebrands it as product. The Archons never needed to strike. They only needed to redirect. The Gnostics imagined the battle as subtle warfare. One text speaks of the soul ascending past each planetary gate after death, offering a password or seal to escape the Archon stationed there. Another tells of Christ tricking the rulers, disguising himself so they could not recognize what slipped past their grasp. Still another claims that when Sophia's spark burns in a human, the Archons snarl and swarm, throwing distractions, terrors, pleasures, anything to prevent the flame from steadying. These images blur myth and psychology, but the function is constant. Awakening is contested. Fringe traditions embellish the scene with a modern gloss. They say the Archons have learned to dress in algorithms, to whisper in infinite scrolls, to craft idols not from stone but from attention. They reward busyness as virtue, distraction as necessity, exhaustion as status. The observer notes the uncanny familiarity. Ancient texts spoke of rulers of fate. Moderns speak of systems too large to resist. The resonance is uncomfortable. Perhaps the masks changed, not the jailers. Yet the myth does not leave the soul defenseless. Christ supplies memory. Sophia supplies hunger. Their union gives the prisoner tools the Archons cannot counterfeit. A parable remembered in silence outlives an advertisement. A desire for truth that aches through grief cannot be purchased away. A spark that knows it is more than dust is a spark that resists chains. Even when bodies remain within the prison, awareness weakens the jail. The Archons thrive on ignorance. Gnosis is corrosion. And so the battle is not fought with spears, but with sight. To see a bar is already to loosen it. To notice the lullaby is already to wake from it. The observer recalls an ancient metaphor. Chains made of mist, unbreakable to the one who believes them iron, useless to the one who discovers the sun can burn them off in minutes. Scholars, of course, caution restraint. They remind us that human oppression has real weight. Armies, taxes, tribunals, and that to spiritualize too much risks neglecting the material injustices that grind lives down. Perhaps the Archons are metaphors for these institutions, or perhaps the institutions are metaphors for the Archons. The myth does not settle the polarity. It invites us to hold both, to read the world doubly. Every law court is both marble and mask, every border both line and enchantment. And in this double reading, the soul learns its most paradoxical weapon. laughter. For the Gnostics, the rulers were not terrifying titans, but brittle usurpers, children playing at gods. Some texts picture Christ laughing at them, laughing as they boast, laughing as they fumble to chain him, laughing as they realize too late that their bars hold nothing. To laugh is not to deny their existence, but to puncture their seriousness. The observer notes how, even in the present, to smile at a system that claims inevitability is to crack its spell. The battle is not won in a day. It is the rhythm of existence itself. To wake, to forget, to wake again. Yet each awakening adds weight to the scale. Each memory threads another path through the labyrinth. If the Archons patrol with vigilance, the Aeons resonate with patience. Time is on the side of resonance. The palace still glitters. The prison still persuades. But in certain corridors, the laughter echoes now. Light, quiet, insistent. It does not yet topple towers. It does something stranger. It reminds the towers that they, too, are temporary. The tale draws itself inward now, like a tide retreating, leaving ripples of light along the sand. From the silence of the monad to the whispers of Sophia, from the brittle boasts of the Demiurge to the laughter that dissolves the Archons, the story has wound its way through fullness and emptiness, prison and palace, call and echo. And here, at its end, it opens not into a verdict, but into a question, the kind that does not close, but lingers like music once the instrument has stopped. The observer slows his pace. He notes how myths rarely conclude with certainty. They end with a gesture, a hand pointing upward, a word left half-finished, a figure disappearing into mist. The Aeons are no exception. Scholars will continue to argue whether they were philosophical allegories, radical poetry, or rival theologies. Historians will debate whether Gnostic sects flourished in the 1st century or blossomed later, fed by disappointment with the empire's power and the church's conformity. Others will trace Sophia's sorrow back to older myths of fallen goddesses, from Inanna's descent to Persephone's loss. The archive has voices enough for all these readings, and the ink is not yet dry. But the myth itself asks a simpler thing. It asks us to remember, not to believe, not to recite, not even to resolve, but to let the resonance brush against the quiet places inside. For the Aeons, if they exist at all, are not waiting in marble palaces beyond the stars. They are forces disguised as memories. They live in sudden clarity, in the longing for justice that no law can satisfy, in the tenderness that outlasts disappointment. They are the more behind the ordinary, glimpsed for a breath before the Archons cover it again. Sophia's spark still flickers in the human heart. In every question that refuses easy answers, in every hunger that is not for bread alone, in every dream that feels older than one's own lifetime. There she is. And Christ's call still threads through the air, not as thunder, but as a phrase overheard at the right moment, a word that turns a day, a rhythm that makes the walls seem less solid. To hear it is to feel the memory of another home pressing gently against this one. The observer allows himself a metaphor. Life is a room with 2 windows. One opens to the street, where Archons parade in disguises of trend and rule. The other opens inward, onto a silence that feels infinite. Most live with the first window open, the noise streaming in, drowning the second. But sometimes, by accident or grace, the inner window stirs, and a draft of other air fills the lungs. That moment is gnosis, not the acquisition of knowledge, but the recognition of origin. Not a new truth, but an old one, remembered. Even here the myth does not demand. It does not say all must awaken, nor that history bends towards some assured victory. It simply plants a suggestion. The prison may not be as firm as it looks. The palace may be a disguise. The key may already be in your hand, and the light you seek may not descend from beyond, but rise from within. The Aeons are forgotten gods only if we mistake gods for thrones and thunder. But if gods can also be principles, whispers, resonances, then they have not been forgotten. They have only been renamed, hidden beneath schedules and laws and explanations. To remember them is to notice the shimmer on the edge of the ordinary, to let the shimmer grow until it is not edge but center. And so the narrative fades, not with conquest, but with reassurance. You are not only matter, you are not only role, you are not only rule. You are a fragment of Sophia's desire, a particle of her flame, a resonance of her echo. To awaken is not to escape the world, but to see through it, until the prison looks less like iron and more like mist burning away at dawn. The observer leaves you here, in that dawn. The palace is still around you. The walls are still tall. But in your hand, you feel the shape of something. Small, warm, half forgotten. A key. The door is still shut, but the lock has begun to loosen. Beyond it waits not heaven, not paradise, not anything that can be measured. Beyond it waits fullness, Pleroma, where silence is not emptiness, but song. And if the myth has done its work, the song has already begun. Not far away, not someday, but here, in the heart that remembers.